So while each Warhammer 40k rules update mainly seeks to bring balance between the factions, Games Workshop also often chooses to make really quite big core rules changes to the game. With another balanced data state fast approaching, let's talk about any other things they might be thinking about doing to the big rulebook. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be interesting to talk about 10th edition rules in general, and if there's anything major that Games Workshop might think about changing in the next balance update due out in the not too distant future. From all Games Workshop's teasers and previews before, it seems that the next balanced data state for Warhammer 40k should be coming out this coming week. They often tend to drop on a Thursday, though not literally every single one has. If it had to gamble on anything, it would probably be on Thursday the 25th of January. They've already told us multiple times that points and rules changes are going to be coming in this one. It's not just a points update. I strongly suspect that the majority of the focus will be on all the faction changes, points costs going up and down. Maybe some factions might need a core rules tweak to make them work a bit better, maybe for example giving the Drukarian Custodes an actual detachment rule that works. But I've already talked about those sort of changes on the channel a few times over now. I'll leave a link down in the video description for my video talking about every single army in the game and some potential points changes for better or worse for them. Games Workshop definitely has a lot of precedent with this though. They often change core rules in one way or another with updates like this. Say for example in 9th edition where they made changes to how many flyers that you could field in game, or certain small FAQs that had really quite big impact, or even tearing up the entire game system as a whole and replacing it with Arcs of Omen as we saw in late 9th edition. They've already done this once over with 10th edition. Several of the core stratagems were altered really quite a lot, specifically Overwatch altered for needing line of sight and not being applicable on towering units, Captain stratagems becoming only battle tactics, and towering not having quite as much impact. In all honesty, they went surprisingly far to make changes to a game that really hadn't been out all that long, and it definitely means that there's the chance that some get tweaked in this time round as well. I would say there's pros and cons to core rules changes. You can genuinely fix issues and make the game better overall, as it is one advantage of embracing a more digital rule set, as they actually seem to have been doing a bit more in 10th edition. It means that if something's broken, it doesn't necessarily have to stay broken, and the fix can be a lot more easily available. On the other hand though, there's definitely a good portion of people that are just happy with them leaving well enough alone, particularly people who might not play it all that regularly or might be a bit more casual and not really care about these finer points of the rules that much. If you make major sweeping changes to the core rules every 3 months or so, you are going to burn plenty of people out who just aren't going to be interested enough to keep up with each change. Overall, in recent years, I feel like Games Workshop have been striking the balance a bit better than they used to. They generally tend to keep rules changes just really focused to a few times in the year, rather than just randomly dropping FAQs just with completely zero notice. I've personally got no major criticisms about the speed that they come out with these. Every 3 to 6 months seems kind of appropriate, and they have already made some very big strides to fixing 10th edition from the broken mess that it was on release. In any case though, for this video, I thought we'd just talk through a few potential areas that seem more likely than most for Games Workshop to potentially fix in some way. Some might see them as problems, some less so, but maybe some of the areas that I've seen discussed most in comments and elsewhere, and also a few responses to my YouTube community post that I made on the subject a few days back. First up though, and something that I've been kind of banging on about since the start of the edition, is that Games Workshop really just needs to do an FAQ for the core rules for 10th edition 40k. There's just been a short list of core things that really aren't clear, and they haven't been since the get-go. And it just seems really weird that they haven't addressed them yet, given how easy it will be just to push out a PDF with a few basic questions. My guess is that we will probably get answers to the majority of these in this update, or at least I'm hoping so. Though if not, I'm hopefully giving Games Workshop a hint by just putting it in one line on this slide and putting a whole bunch of flames underneath it. I feel like the things that need addressing are perhaps particularly obvious from Games Workshop's World Champions of Warhammer. That was their flagship tournament, and it had an official FAQ published for that event that didn't apply to the wider game, just that tournament, but it really did a good job of highlighting a whole bunch of questions that basically need to be answered one way or the other if you're going to have plenty of rules functional. I felt like for that FAQ there were some things that I agreed with and some things less so, but I feel like we're probably going to be odds on to get something like that this time round that might come in the form of updates to the slightly poorly named rules commentary document that they have alongside the core rules, which essentially functions as a massive great appendix of Warhammer 40k rules and actually does make very specific and important changes and clarification to the core rules, so really it is just an extension of the core rules. I feel like the name rules commentary is a bit of a misnomer really. I guess just for the sake of consolidating everything, I could see why they might want to put it in there. Though a short and sweet FAQ document just answering a few basic questions probably would be fine as well. Getting into some of these specific issues, here are just a few of the ones that I think are maybe more important for them to resolve one way or the other. Most of them, I say, do already have a fairly common way that the community tends to play them, though I've seen literally all of them debated in one way or another. Rattling through them, I think it would be nice to clarify how Big Guns Never Tire interacts with Overwatch. The section's really quite confusingly worded, and most people tend to play it that if you're locked in combat and using the Big Guns Never Tire rule, you're not allowed to shoot out of combat at something else. Although sort of intuitively it feels like you should be able to me, just with the whole principle that being in combat doesn't stop vehicles shooting at other things these days. Not sure I really mind which way they come down on that one, other than just deciding it. Otherwise, one that's kind of irritated me since the start of the edition is that there's a whole bunch of abilities out there that grant a free Overwatch thing, and only override the once per phase restriction for normal stratagems, but don't actually override the restriction of once per turn on the Overwatch stratagem itself. It just seems very unclear what their intent is here. Are they intending for Overwatch to be able to be fired multiple times within the army if you have one of these rules? As if they are, then they need to specifically override the once per turn restriction, otherwise it doesn't work. I've seen at least some debate about redeploy and teleport ability type units that sort of take you off the board, put you into strategic reserve, and then the rule specifically states that you come back in the next reinforcement phase. That somewhat clashes with mission rules saying that reinforcements can't come in on battle round 1. I've definitely seen that one debated. It'd be just nice to clarify which one takes precedence. Otherwise, for redeploying, it would be good to have something to say how infiltrators and redeploy type units work. For example, if you have a rule that allows you to redeploy 3 different units in your army after both sides have set up, are you allowed to make use of the infiltrate rule? In general, I've seen that played as no, but again, I feel like that will be handy enough to underline if that is the case. Otherwise, with things that sub in for dice, like Strands of Fate and Acts of Faith, can they be used on rerolls? I feel like most of the community was playing that they couldn't before, but then in the World Champions of Warhammer document, they said that you could, which makes it kind of weird for the Eldari in particular, means that you could potentially have a big anti-tank shot, attempts to make a wound roll, and then plug in the Strands of Fate on your reroll for the battle host. If you don't get a result that you like the first time, kind of allows you to fish for results before committing. Another one that I think needs a simple resolution is that units that generate command points in the command phase. There's some people that argue by a little sentence in the core rulebook saying that they're exempt from the general CP farming restrictions, where you can only get 1 per turn. For me, that's quite clearly talking about just your standard sort of Battleforge CP, but I've seen it argued otherwise. Again, it would be nice just to put that to rest so there's no debate. Another one I've seen some people arguing is that common redeploy abilities, such as the Deceiver or Law Solar and things, might happen after the roll for first turn has been done. I feel like the general consensus is that it happens before you know the result of first turn, unless it's something specific like the Space Marine Phobos Captain. But again, if there's any room for debate, it's right for an FAQ. And perhaps one of the most confusing ones is what exactly ignores modifiers means. For say units like Mortarion and Trajan Valoris, the designer's commentary I think almost makes this more confusing than otherwise. Perhaps the biggest question is whether or not it works on sort of dice that have generated attacks. Say for example, does it work on wound rolls and damage results? Does that still count as part of the unit's profile? Or is that considered no longer part of the unit's profile once it's become an attack? Again, not really too fussed either way on the result of that one myself, but it'd be nice to have a clear answer spelled out rather than having to wade through several sections of rules in the designer's commentary. Overall, if Games Workshop just gave a very simple and clear yes or no answer, or spelled out what each of these rules mean, I feel like that'd be a big blow to fixing some of the most major problems of Warhammer 40k, even if there's loads of things that are more specific or unique to one given faction. Otherwise though, beyond just actually making their rule set a bit more functional, there's all sorts of things that people kind of debate for actual rules changes in Warhammer 40k. Generally things that I think that some people would quite happily see and other people might be dead against, and some maybe seem a bit more likely or unlikely than others. First up, one thing that I certainly could see them doing might be a bit of a swing back as to their previous change with devastating wounds that they did in the last balanced Dataslate. Last update, they chose to flip it from being mortal wounds that a devastating wound of a 6 generated to simply a wound that ignores all saves and invulnerable saves. The reason being to stop massive anti-tank weapons like, say, Eldar Wraith Knight Wraith Cannons from just getting a 6 maybe automatically plugged in and just deleting an entire unit with a gun that's supposed to be good at killing tanks only. It weakened the power of the rule in quite a lot of circumstances, though weirdly it made devastating wounds actually better against things that had some sort of mortal wound protection, which to me didn't really seem like it was the intention for that change at all. There are quite a few things in Warhammer 40k that have various special rules to give you a feel no pain type save against mortal wounds, the single most notable being the Adeptus Custodes, who have it as their detachment rule with the Aegis of the Emperor to try and keep them safe against something that would otherwise kill them quite quickly. There's plenty of other examples though, things like Space Marine Chaplains, or weirdly enough, Town Broadsides. I feel like it might be on a few people's wish list if they said that these mortal wound type saving throws also worked on devastating wounds as well, as they did to start with, as otherwise it's just decreased the value of that rule by an enormous amount, as previously the biggest and most impactful way that you'd see mortal wounds on the tabletop was usually through spam of devastating wounds. I feel at the very least they should make that change for the Custodes if nothing else, though I think maybe just a blanket rule to return the protection against devastating wounds for all the other mortal wound save units out there would probably be sensible. One that gets talked about quite a lot and has big past precedents from Games Workshop are all the Objective Control Zero units doing tactical secondary objectives. At the moment in 40k, it's very much the fashion to often be running lots of mindless swarms and things to maybe pop out of strategic reserve and do positional board secondary objective things like deploy teleport homers in the opponent's deployment zone, behind enemy lines, investigating signals in the corners, or engaging on all fronts. It means that often these absolutely tiny units that aren't really expected to do anything else in game are perhaps weirdly good at doing these specific missions that you might expect units of infiltrators or actual squads to go and do. Things like Nurglings, Fenrisian Wolves, Tyrannid Ripper Swarms, or Spore Mines fired out of Biovores. I feel like sometimes it does feel like it makes sense. Say, for example, you could imagine Nurglings very much spreading Nurgle's influence behind the scenes, or perhaps a squad of Servitors tasked to deploy a teleport homer. Others maybe feel a bit more weird, such as the Space Wolves very kindly asking their undomesticated Fenrisian wolf packs to go and deploy the teleport homer or investigate the signal and report back. Feels like something out of Lassie. I think the reason that people are kind of half expecting this one is that they made a very similar move in 9th edition. Early in the edition we had loads of spam of very small units doing things like engage on all fronts, and then Games Workshop put a lot more restrictions on it in that you needed quite a big squad to do so, and this feels kind of similar. It might happen now, or it might happen next time they do the mission pack for 40k. If we get a new mission deck after the Leviathan one, then maybe it might happen then. I'm perhaps a little bit split as to whether or not this is really a bad thing for the game though. It does give you a big incentive to take a few of these random nuisance units on the periphery of your army, and generally means that you want a few of them but not really all that many, and they're not really expected to carry your main damage and defense while they're doing their tasks. You might just sort of move the goalpost a little bit and just make it very good for anything that did have at least 1 point of OC to do these things, like maybe Inquisitorial Henchmen, or Sister Battle Crusaders and units of 2. You might just make a bunch of these very tiny units a lot less useful, and a few of the others really quite good as they have at least 1 OC. Let me know what you think of that one though, and whether you'd be tempted to change it yourself. Next up, one major area of the 40k rules that felt perhaps a bit less thought through were the aircraft. Currently as a class in Warhammer 40k, they are pretty universally awful, only a few things really stand out as kind of worth using. I feel like this might be partly by design, as whenever armies that rely on flyers too much, like Orc flyer spam or Abmech flyer spam in 9th edition, or Eldari flyers in 8th edition get good, it generally shows that Games Workshop has messed up in some way, and tends to lead to games that are just really all about the alpha strike and aren't that rewarding. In 10th edition though, flyers as a class just have huge disadvantages. Non-hover ones have to start off the board, so could come in turn 2 only. Then when they're there, they have to have locked movement paths. They can't pivot before they get to move, they can only pivot after, so your opponent knows exactly where they're going next turn, and could potentially use them to cleverly screen them and have them forced to fly off the board, or know exactly where they'll have to go. They're also Objective Control Zero, so won't be helping out with primary objectives, which is a bit of a weakness if you're investing quite a lot of points in them. Two classes that really stand out are Bomber Flyers and Transport Flyers. Bomber Flyers rules just seem horribly thought out. In general, if you've got an aircraft like the Orc Burner Bomber, it does have to arrive turn 2, and that means that the only time that you can first potentially move, unless you've done something with rapid ingress, which probably isn't worth it, will be moving on turn 3 to drop a bomb, by which time certain games of 40k might already be decided for the positive or the negative, or at least nearly so. What's even worse though is that your opponent does have the ability just to walk out the way, as they can't pivot before they bomb. So if they really do care all that much about the mortal wound damage they're likely going to suffer, they could just move. Transport flyers maybe don't really seem to have fared much better. The non-hover ones they seem to be fixing by giving rules to allow them to arrive turn 1, which at least helps out a little bit I suppose. but anything that can hover is kind of awful unless you put it in hover mode and then use it as a taxi to move 20 inches and drop turn 1, which I guess does have some interest, but it does mean that you're paying really quite a big tax in points for that ability most of the time. Just in general, I feel like the majority of the flyers could be significantly helped with points increases if they were at least somewhat efficient gun turrets. You might get people using them, though I'm sure Games Workshop don't want to put people in a position where they're feeling forced to spam them, as that never ends well. It does feel that most of them are just kind of aggressively weak for damage and defense though, even in context of their good movement. Next up, a common thing that's been talked about for Battle Shock since the edition started was talking about the possibility of units needing to test to regroup if they happen to have been battle shocked in a unit that wouldn't normally need to test in the command phase otherwise. Currently in 40k, I would say that battle shock is actually meaningful. It can be a genuinely big deal if you have a depleted squad and they just fail to hold an objective, and occasionally desperate escape or the no stratagems thing does have some annoyance. At the moment though, it feels like quite a vast set of battle shock rules are just kind of rubbish in Warhammer 40k. Anything that hands out a battle shock test during your turn. Say for example, if this Infernus Marine hands out a battle shock test to this Chaos Space Marine here, he might fail it in the Space Marine player's turn, be unable to use stratagems that he might not have been planning to use anyway for the rest of that turn, and then just automatically recover it again in the Chaos player's command phase at the start of their turn before any objectives are scored. It means that most units that actually have a battle shock focused special rule are kind of at a loss for that. Some factions might be able to get a bit more value with things like Tyranids converting it into a +1 to wound with Neurolictors, or Chaos Knights getting damage boosts, but for the majority of rules in the game it is kind of bad. I have certainly seen it suggests a lot that making enemies have to test to regroup if they fail in your turn due to one of these rules could be an interesting way to make it far more meaningful. I still say that those rules maybe aren't the most exciting in the world. Say if you wanted to make this Chaos Space Marine fail Battle Shock and actually not be able to contest a primary objective, that both have to fail Battle Shock in your own turn and then again when they try to regroup in theirs. But it would definitely mess with the certainty of a Chaos player that they could hold an objective for guaranteed, and it might make some of the many Battle Shock units out there, like Infernus Marines or Primaris Reavers, just that little bit more spooky. Let me know what you think though, if Battle Shock needs to be made any more relevant in game than it already is, or if it's already kind of fine. I feel like one other thing that might be criticised about it is the weirdness that you get with units that can't go below half strength. If say you've got a 2 model unit, then the unit can never be below half strength, so it never needs to test Battle Shock, and that does feel kind of strange to me. Otherwise, one thing that I saw mentioned a few times in my post for suggestions for core rule changes was a general desire for the fly keywords to be a little bit more impactful. Quite a lot of people are having a bit of a hangover from 9th edition here, where fly made a lot of armies just spectacularly able to ignore terrain all over the board, specifically monsters, vehicles, and mounted units, that in the current edition of the game, they actually need to go round things like ruins, as usually fly up and over of them it just isn't worth it enough in terms of the movement distances. Previously, say, if you had a Drukhari Ravager like this one, you could have it parked behind a really big, tall, line of sight blocking ruin, and then just jump straight over it when you wanted to expose yourself and start shooting. Now, if the ruin's tall enough, you might have to say move up 6 inches and down 6 inches to get to the other side, meaning that realistically there's no way you're going over it and you need to go around it. I feel like this one's maybe a bit more divisive than some of the others that I mentioned so far. For a lot of players, I feel like they'd really quite like to see this. I guess it's particularly relevant for armies like Drukhari that feel just generally underpowered right now. Lots of reasons why you could weigh up why they are underpowered, but I guess the fly keyword being very relevant on plenty of their units, like the mounted Hellions and Reavers as well, is quite a big deal for them. Definitely not saying that they couldn't be made strong without any changes to that. You could do it by points or other special rules, but this could be one way to help them out. I feel like it's perhaps often a bit of a mistake though to try and fix one specific army's problems with a game-wide patch, as you wind up buffing a massive amount of units that are otherwise kind of fine, and you might need to go across most of the game with a whole bunch of points cost updates. I feel like it would also be a big blow to actually making terrain more relevant in 10th edition, which I don't really think is a bad thing overall. Having just a huge chunk of armies in the game being able to effectively ignore the movement restrictions with it will make unit positioning quite a lot less important, which I'm not necessarily sure is great from a sort of tactical gameplay point of view. Let me know what you think though. Would you be tempted to mess around with any changes to the fly keyword, or is it good as is? Otherwise, maybe just for a few other things that I've seen mentioned quite a bit, though I don't really have quite as much intelligent to say about. I've certainly seen it raised that captains and their equivalents only being allowed to get battle tactic stratagems for free still feels pretty strange. For me, that was perhaps the single most surprising change they made at the last balanced data slate as a way to limit the power of free stratagems. It locked out captains and their equivalents in other armies for being able to get free things like Overwatch and plenty of other powerful stratagems. Looking at the armies and the way that they're set up, though, it just feels a bit suspect as to whether or not this was any sort of actual initial design from Games Workshop. The stratagem classes do seem to be handed out kind of arbitrarily, a lot more about theme and the way that things happen in game, as opposed to being specifically selected for gameplay. It is also a bit strange as well that plenty of detachments have battle tactics handed out very unevenly. Some detachments have loads, some have absolutely none, meaning that you might have a faction's captain equivalent not being very good for anything more than command point rerolls. I guess I wouldn't necessarily expect Games Workshop to mess around with that further, though I must admit it still feels like a rule that's a bit strange, even if it still kind of works out fine for plenty of different armies' characters like this. Otherwise, just for a few other talking points that I've seen mentioned, Titanic units overwatching maybe could be changed to a 2 CP. I feel like that might have been a bit more nice to them rather than just flat out banning it, even if Games Workshop don't seem to be doing variable cost stratagems in 10th edition by design. I feel like they're perhaps unlikely to change that at this point, but it was certainly an enormous blow to things like the Knight Acheron or the Valiant, going from being kind of gods of Overwatch to utterly underpowered as a result. I guess you could just adapt their points costs and say they still can't do it, but feels like you've just outright removed an option for Titanic Knight armies, where they could have just costed it a bit more fairly. Otherwise, for criticisms of 10th edition, I certainly imagine that a fair few people would like to see a return of cost for points per model or points per piece of war gear. Realistically, though, I don't think that either of those things are going to happen. That would require Games Workshop just absolutely upending their point system once more. I'd guess they don't really feel like it's such a problem that they're going to fix it that sort of way. I feel like we're going to be stuck with points per squad until at least 11th edition, and there's nothing to say that Games Workshop would change their tune then either. Otherwise, certain abilities being inactive if a character is embarked within a transport feels a bit off. As per the designer's commentary, I believe that, say, if you had a command point farming character, unless the rule actually required them to be on the table, they might be able to farm those command points in reserve, but weirdly not if they're embarked on a transport on the table, and that feels strange. And otherwise, in that post that I made, a few people were criticising lines of sight in one way or another, either wanting a bit more of a reversion to true line of sight type things, or not enjoying the very true line of sight that you get by drawing any point of a model to any point of another model, as it just feels a bit weird to, say, be able to see a model a bit easier if they'd been modelled with a back banner versus not doing so. Personally, I feel like that's kind of unlikely to change. It's just so much easier from a rules perspective to be able to say, yes, it's an abstraction, and you can just draw a line of sight from any point to any point, rather than having to exhaustively go through all the limbs, appendages, weapons, and banners and things that do or don't count out there. In any case, though, let me know your thoughts. Is there anything that you particularly want to see change about the core rules of 10th edition 40k right now? Or do you prefer that Games Workshop just leaves well enough alone and focuses on balancing factions either by points or rules? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts or suggestions down in the comments. Otherwise, feel free to check out that video that I made talking through each faction in Warhammer 40k with a balanced data slate and a few potential things that might go up or down in points. I'll leave that linked in the video description. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly do keep the 40k videos coming just about every day. Looking forward to covering the balanced data slate in detail once we get it. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.